Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. Today, let's talk GDP growth. After averaging 2.9% per annum for the last 3 years, GDP growth in the first quarter was surprising at a negative 0.50%, largely due to companies scrambling to prepare for the coming changes in tariffs. The number for the second quarter will be released in just a few days, on July 30th, and we'll learn a lot and report to you about the underlying strength of the economy when we see that number. But as it stands now, the consensus forecast for U.S. GDP growth rate for 2025, 2026, and 2027, and this is prior to the calculated impact of President Trump's big, beautiful bill and any certainty about where tariffs will end up. But the forecast prior to all that was 1.5% for 2025, 1.5% to 1.6% for 2026, and then rising to 2 to 2.2% in 2027. But that bill and those tariffs obviously bring a lot of change to the U.S. economy. So let's look at the projected impact of these piece by piece. First come the tax cuts. The headline number here is huge. According to Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation, the tax relief in this bill totals $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. However, the vast majority of these tax cuts are simply extensions of the tax provisions first enacted in 2017. These extensions have been widely assumed by forecasters to remain in place one way or the other. So they do not provide any new stimulus to growth. If the BBB had not been enacted and they had expired, that would have been big news. It would have resulted in a major reduction in GDP, well over 1 percentage point per year. That said, there are some significant new tax cuts beyond the mere extension of existing cuts, particularly in the first few years. For 25, 26, and 27, these new provisions amount to net tax cuts of $125 billion, $255 billion, and $156 billion, respectively, the equivalent of about 0.4%, 0.9%, and 0.5% of GDP in each of these respective years. Among the notable new tax cuts are exemptions on tips and overtime, both scheduled to expire in 2028. They're expected to save workers $43 billion in 26, $33 billion in 27. Together, that's about 0.10% benefit to GDP per year. In addition, the bill includes enhancements to the standard deduction, the child tax credit, and a new $6,000 bonus deduction for senior citizens. Combined, these three provisions are projected to cut taxes by about $16.8 billion in 25, $52 billion in 26, and $49 billion in 27. This bill also creates some very nice incentives for the real estate industry. Perhaps something not surprising since our president is a real estate guy. But as we have long said, it is also true that real estate is the largest sector in the economy, so a boost to that industry can have the greatest boost to the overall economy. And the real estate industry is rejoicing, claiming that the new tax law supercharges home ownership and investment. Key changes in this area include raising the SALT deduction cap from $10,000 to $40,000, a major benefit for property owners in high-tax states, as well as bonus depreciation and immediate expensing designed to encourage new investment in real estate development and related industries. These new or expanded provisions are projected to reduce taxes by $43 billion in 25, $123 billion in 26, and $104 billion in 27, which will add 10 basis points, 40 basis points, and 30 basis points to GDP in these years, respectively. It's an unexpectedly solid pro-growth package. But that's not the whole story. The bill includes spending reductions, and outside of the bill, we obviously have new tariffs and immigration restrictions, each which has the potential to put a drag on growth. Let's take a closer look at how those elements could offset the gains. First, tariffs. We've long articulated a concern about the U.S. trade deficit, and the tariffs are a valid tool in addressing that, though it's not clear to us that the current approach is the optimal path. Nevertheless, let's look at the implications on GDP. The key to understanding the impact of tariffs on GDP is to make sure and have a clear understanding of what GDP really is. The easiest way to understand GDP, it is simply a measure of total spending in the economy. Spending goes up, that's the same thing as saying GDP goes up. Now, it's also a measure of production, but those are simply two sides of the same coin. If you produce a widget and I buy that widget, those equal each other. That as background, it's easy to see that if spending goes up, including government spending, that is tantamount to GDP going up. GDP is a measure of spending, not deficit reduction. For decades now, increased deficits have themselves brought increased GDP. The most dramatic example, the most obvious example, was the federal spending for COVID relief, which boosted GDP and without which GDP would have collapsed. According to the White House, tariff revenue in 2025 is expected to be $217 billion higher than baseline levels that existed before the tariffs were introduced. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates that additional tariff revenue will reach $299 billion in 26 and $275 billion in 27. The White House is celebrating this increased revenue. But while this revenue may reduce the deficit, it won't increase GDP one whit unless it translates or results in increased government spending. Instead, these tariffs will likely result in reduced private sector spending. It is U.S. importers that actually pay the tariffs, and those importers have choice to make at that point. They can either absorb that expense, which means they'll earn less, or they can spend less elsewhere, for example, by laying off employees, or they can pass it on to the consumer. And most likely, they will all resort to a combination of all three of these. For that portion they pass on to the consumer, that consumer can either absorb it or spend less elsewhere. So we are likely to see some reduction in spending at both the importer and consumer level. We don't yet know how all these increased tariffs will play out in that regard. It's been almost a century since we had tariffs broadly at this high level. It could be that tariffs have no impact on GDP, or it could be the 180 degrees the opposite, with tariffs reducing GDP dollar for dollar. But it'll likely end up somewhere in between. Who knows? Let's take a swag and say that half of that amount will end up as reduced GDP in the form of reduced sales, which, if true, would result in a reduction of 40 basis points to GDP in 2025, 50 basis points in 26, and 50 basis points in 27. How about those vaunted spending cuts, DOGE and otherwise? Remember that DOGE promised $2 trillion in cuts, an estimate quickly revised down to $175 billion, in which some private estimates put as low as $30 billion. Remember, reduced spending means reduced GDP, so from a pure GDP standpoint, the smaller than advertised amount of these cuts is favorable news. These include highly controversial cuts in Medicaid, SNAP, the proposed research budget cuts to the NIH and NSF, student loan reform, and other smaller items. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the bulk of these spending cuts, particularly Medicaid reform, won't even start in earnest till 2028. In fact, after decreasing expense by $21 billion in 25, the CBO estimates that spending will increase slightly in 26 and 27 in the amounts of $31 billion and $21 billion respectively. That amounts to a 10 basis point GDP decrease in 25, 10 basis point increase in 26 and 27. Our purpose today is not to make a political judgment about these or to make an assessment of how much of all of this is impacting the less well-off and helping the wealthy. That's another analysis for another day. Though suffice to say, it is widely viewed that these adversely hurt the less well-off and bring benefit to the wealthy. Our job today is simply to assess aggregate impact on GDP. Next, let's look at immigration. Immigrants spend, and if you reduce immigrants, either by shutting the border or by removing those that are already here, you lose that spending. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that if we lose 1.3 million workers through deportation, that will cost $250 billion per year from 25 to 28, or 80 basis points, 0.80% of GDP. For a somewhat more conservative view, we would look at a study from the Brookings Institution. They evaluate the overall impact of Trump's policies on a net migration basis and find that GDP would be negatively impacted in the range of 30 to 110 billion per year. Taking the midpoint of that range suggests an average annual GDP reduction of about 20 basis points, or 0.20%. And we'll use that estimate for our purposes. So let's total all that up. The tax reductions add to GDP. The spending reductions don't appear to be large enough to have a material impact one way or the other. And the tariff and immigration policies will have an adverse effect on GDP growth. So, in total, we see that the aggregate impact of all these is that GDP drops by 20 basis points in 2025, increases by 20 basis points in 2026, and then drops again by 10 basis points in 2027. That's all to say that there's not that much impact one way or the other. It's certainly not the rocket fuel that its proponents claim, but it's also not the catastrophe that its adversaries claim. Again, we're not talking about the implications for the country's social fabric, just the one dimension of GDP itself. There are at least two wildcards. First is the possibility of lower interest rates. If we see the Fed engineer greater reductions in rates than currently assumed by forecasters, that could be a benefit that offsets much of the negative we've estimated here. The second is increased real estate activity as a result of the tax changes on that industry. As we've often said, that's our largest industry, and some momentum there could be a very nice positive. We'll just have to wait and see. That's it for this week. Thanks.